What is up, YouTube? Welcome back to a very special episode of The Human Perspective. And you guys are probably asking, well, who's this new guy on Judy's channel? Well, I'm Marc Climaco and I am disabled. I am also the Strategic Communications Officer at the Ford Foundation, where I lead communication strategy on Ford's work in disability inclusion. And today, of course, is going to be a very special episode indeed, because this year marks the 30th anniversary of the American with Disabilities Act of 1990. We had just celebrated this recently on July 26. And Judy and I had a great conversation a couple of weeks ago, and we thought that it would be really great to bring together Judy along with today's frontline activists in the disability rights work to have a bit of an intergenerational conversation about the legacy of the ADA and the work ahead. So we're going to be doing that in this very special episode. But before then, please hit that subscribe button and also that notification button so you know when new videos come up. Well, today in this conversation, of course, we have Judy Heumann. Hi, Judy.
Hi, how are you, Mark? Happy ADA.
Judy, of course, is an internationally recognized disability rights advocate, and her work with a wide range of activist groups and NGOs and governments across the world have helped pave the way for landmark policies, including the 504, the Rehabilitation Act, the American with Disabilities Act, and many others that have benefited the disabled community. She is also one of the main stars of a documentary called Crip Camp that documents the history of the disability rights movement, where it started from. And you can definitely tune into that on Netflix. And representing the millennial generation, what we also call as the ADA generation, is Katherine Perez. Hi, Katherine.
Hi, Mark.
I do want to clarify a few things about millennials. We are not young anymore. We're close to 40. Some of us have family. Some of us have children who are probably graduating high school right now. And I'm saying that because millennials are not the next generation anymore. We are today's generation. Do you agree with that, Katherine? Do you agree? Yeah?
Yeah, I would agree with that, except I don't have a family or kids yet. A lot of us have dog kids, so I have 2 dog children.
Hit that like button if you agree. And I say that because Katherine, has been paving the way for a new generation of disability justice leaders today. Katherine, of course, is a third-generation Mexican-American attorney. She is a scholar and an activist. She lives in LA, and she is also the inaugural executive director of the Qualo Center for Disability Law, Policy, and Innovation at Loyola Law School, where she also teaches disability law. All right, well, let's go ahead and start this conversation. And my first question will be for Judy. It's hard to fathom, right, that we're already celebrating the 30th anniversary of the ADA. It feels like, I'm sure for many, 1990, it feels like, just a few days ago. So I'd love to get some reflections from you in terms of, what it really took, to get to the ADA.
Thank you, Mark. That was a really great question. And I'm 72 years old. And the reason I mention that is when I was growing up in Brooklyn, New York, there were no laws. There was no 504. There was no Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. There was no Americans with Disabilities Act. And really not very many people thinking about it. When you look at the 60s and many of the advancements that came about in the civil rights movement, in particular, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, disability was not a part of that piece of legislation. The disability movement itself at that point, I think, was a combination of many different stovepipes. So the disabled veterans definitely had and still have some very strong organizations that at that point really focused on vets. Today, some of the organizations are not just working on disabled veterans issues, but issues across disability in the areas that they prioritize. And we've had organizations like the National Association of the Deaf, the National Federation of the Blind, the American Council of the Blind, United Cerebral Palsy, March of Dimes, etc., organizations that worked on a particular group of disabled people. But some of the unique aspects of what have gone on that enabled us to get the Americans with Disabilities Act, and before that, Section 504, really was our ability as disabled people to begin to come together and break down, they're not broken down, but begin to break down the stovepipes of the different categories of disabilities. Because there are so many different labels of disability, which are relevant in certain ways, but when we're looking at where we are today with a very strong focus on disability justice, we're not looking at the medical aspect as the primary issues that we're trying to address. We're trying to address issues that deal with discrimination. And I would say that another important part of the changes that have gone on over the last number of decades is, while the word discrimination was being utilized by the Black community, the Latino community, the Asian community, the gay and lesbian community, women's movement, Grey Panthers, Grey Panthers as well as Black Panthers, but the Grey Panthers at that time was a progressive organization run by older people. And they were all talking about discrimination. In the area of disability, discrimination was not the primary focus of the discussion. The primary focus of the discussion still at that point was the medical model, charity, help the hopeless, helpless, cripple. It really wasn't looking at what were we being denied as disabled individuals with different disabilities from different racial backgrounds, different religious backgrounds, different sexually oriented backgrounds. People were not looking at that, and nor were we as disabled people. I think one of the important aspects of what's gone on over the last number of decades is that we have, on our own, really moved forward in creating what we call the disability rights movement and disability rights independent living movement, various names. But the premise around this is that as disabled individuals, we are proud. Our disabilities are something that we are not wanting to be hidden. And that really has enabled us not only to become much more engaged in leading a movement, but also in paving the road that we want to travel by, as opposed to others being the ones who are paving a road that we did not want to travel on. So I think that has been a substantive reason why we were able to get the 504 reg signed and why we were able to get the Americans with Disabilities Act, because it necessitated us recognizing that we had to come together. One of the important parts about the Americans with Disabilities Act that I think we need to look at beyond the substance of the law is getting a piece of national legislation meant that we had to get our House of Representatives and our US senators to understand that discrimination was something that was occurring in every part of every state, in the union. That we needed a national piece of legislation that clearly stated that discrimination would be illegal in the public and private sector, and that we were really looking at revamping our country to remove the barriers that have plagued us. One of the major issues, for example, has been in the area of employment, which we can get into talking more about later. But before the 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act, it was not illegal at the national level to discriminate against someone in the employment of disabled people in a privately funded program. And that began to change after Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act came into force. So changes, we as a community are coming together, becoming an ever stronger cross-disability rights movement. We are really encouraging others from the 61 million disabled people that live in this country to really throw off their shackles and call them shackles, because many people have been afraid of speaking up about their disability. they've been ashamed or they haven't been encouraged to, or they feel that maybe my disability is not as significant as somebody else's, so I shouldn't speak about it. But what we're saying is we need to be our 61 million strong, and that's where we're moving.
Well, that's really amazing, Judy, and I'm really, really happy that you brought up intersectionality as well, because that has been, a core part of the disability rights movement throughout the decades, before, during, and after the ADA, of course. But, we'll go talk about that, expand on that for sure later on. I do want to turn to Katherine. Hi, Katherine. I know in our discussions, you've mentioned that disability has been a big part of your life, growing up, from your family and from your personal experience as well. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about that. And then as a follow-up, I'd love to know from your perspective, how do you think the ADA has impacted you and the communities that you are a part of and that you're working with?
Yes, I have been on quite a disability identity journey throughout my life. I was born in 1984, so just a few years before the ADA, but definitely 11 years after Section 504. So a lot of things that Judy fought for, I was able to enjoy as I was growing up, which is why they call us also the ADA generation. But my sense of disability justice really was formed because of my little sister. And my little sister has intellectual disability, went through special ed throughout school. She's also autistic and has developed psychiatric disabilities. But when I was younger, I was very much plugged into the disability community because of her experiences. She went through special ed. She did Special Olympics. I was always volunteering or, being a sister to someone with a disability. And so to me, that was what disability was. But I myself, from my earliest memories, grew up with psychiatric disability. Although, of course, when I was younger, I didn't have the language to call it psychiatric disability or even mental illness, right? It was something that I kept very much hidden. I come from a Mexican family, and I know, other folks of color can relate that mental illness is very stigmatized in our communities. It still is. And it's something that, I didn't feel like I could speak up about. And again, I really didn't even have the language at like a very early age. So I always say like my first step of my identity was as a sibling. Like I understood the disability community through my sister. But then when I was in high school and I became suicidal, I finally came out to my parents. I've come out to them a couple of times now, but I came out to my parents that I had mental illness essentially, and they plugged me right into the psychiatric system. So, I was on a suicidal hotline that evening when I came out to them. They took me to a psychiatrist. That very next week, I got put on medication. I got a therapist. So this was like the second phase of my identity formation, and that was really identifying as someone who has mental illness. So still, I didn't really feel part of the disability community. I was like tangential to that. And it wasn't until actually I went to law school in my 20s, my mid-20s, that I started really learning about the MAD movement and learning language. Like I said, I went from no language to identifying as someone with mental illness to understanding that psychiatric disabilities, mental disabilities are part of the disability community. And so over the last 10 plus years, I've actually been identifying as disabled and coming out a lot with that. And I think, it also shows where we've gone, from earlier times where the disability movement may have been more focused on like physical or intellectual developmental disabilities to now more folks like me with non-apparent disabilities, claiming their place within our community. And by the way, I use the term non-apparent as opposed to something like invisible disability, because I feel like most of the time it's probably not apparent that I have a disability, but there are some times that I feel like it is kind of apparent that I have a disability because even though I have a psychiatric disability, I believe in the connection between mind and body and the manifestations of it play out.
Well, that's really great, Katherine. And what about intersectionality? how do you see intersectionality now, 30 years after the ADA, in relation to the disability justice movement? And Judy mentioned it earlier. I think there's definitely a new generation now who are leading the way when it comes to disability rights work, and who's evolving, this movement to become more intersectional. What does that look like today?
Well, now we're in Disability Pride Month in July, right? Yay. But just a few weeks ago, we were finishing up LGBTQ Pride Month, and I was at, it actually was a Pride/BLM solidarity march here in Long Beach. And I've been going to marches and protests and that stuff for a while now. But I went to this one and I was just completely blown away at the type of access that they had for people with disabilities. I mean, they had the sign language interpreter, they had the preferred seating, they had a whole booth for disability access. I mean, it was just incredible. It kind of really blew me away that, the main organizers of this march was Black Lives Matter and Pride Long Beach. But that disability, you could see, you could just visibly see it throughout the entire march, was a part of the organizing from the very top of putting that event together. And so to me, that was just a visual representation of how far we've come in terms of intersectional justice and blending our movements together.
Well, Judy, let me turn to you. What did intersectional work look like, at your time, back in the day before the ADA?
So I'd like to also speak about the past and where we are now. But in the past, so it's very interesting. I went from Brooklyn to Berkeley, California. And in Berkeley, that's where an organization called the Center for Independent Living was being established. And in the disability rights movement, the independent living movement is a very important part of work that's been going on, in part because the centers actually now statutorily need to be cross-disability organizations. But that was not something that was mandated in the beginning. It was something that we at the Berkeley Center and others in California, and California was the leader on the establishment of centers because there were two states, I think. California had 10 centers by about 1977, 78, whereas there were about 3 or 4 around the country. And then there was federal legislation that established another 10 centers. So when the Berkeley CIL started, for example, it started out as an organization working with disabled people who had physical disabilities of all types, as well as people who are blind and low vision. So that in and of itself was unique for that period of time. And the center was at that point doing a combination of public policy work, dealing with getting funding from the city government, the county government, the state government, and looking at issues around personal assistance services, access, cross-disability. When I went on the board in 73, but when I started working at the center in 1976, and a number of younger disabled people from New York City had moved to Berkeley who had their disabilities, like myself, mainly when we were children. And so there was an interesting disconnect because the people who had started CIL, many of whom also had been graduates of UC Berkeley, were not disabled people who went through the special ed system. And deafness was not a part of what was going on at the CIL, nor were we doing any work with people with intellectual disabilities or psychosocial disabilities. So that was something that we gradually started to expand, and we also became more intergenerational. So I think it's historically very interesting to look at how, as communities of disabled people, we have been separated by the date of our onset of our disability. Because if you became disabled like as a teenager or an adult, you went through whatever the regular education system was. At that period in time, in the 60s and 70s, many of us were in segregated elementary schools, some people in segregated high schools. Many people, even if they went to college, didn't have the opportunity to pursue an area of study that they were interested in. So, for example, I did not major in education, although I wanted to be a teacher, because there were no laws at that time that said if you were qualified to be a teacher, you couldn't be discriminated against based on disability. And my disabled friends in high school said, don't major in education because the agency that was going to provide funding for me to go to school would not support me. Tell them you want to study in one of the fields that are acceptable. And at that point, it was mainly, not exclusively, but mainly social work and speech pathology for young women, and accounting and one or two other areas for men. Fast forward through 504 and the ADA, now people are pursuing degrees in whatever area we're interested and qualified for. So a huge difference. But we, at the Berkeley Center, we were really pulling together our different areas of personal experience. So when the younger group of us, or those of us with our disabilities when we were younger, first got involved with CIL, you could see some immediate changes. So for example, we started focusing on issues on education with disabled children. We brought parents in to work with them on becoming advocates for their children, to be able to be in integrated school settings as the IDEA was going into place. We started doing work in the area of deafness because a deaf man came to the center one day in a wheelchair, and he was born deaf, but then in his adult life, he was hit by a car and he became a triplegic. And the organization that he hung out with, the deaf group, was in a physically inaccessible building. And there were all kinds of things that he needed now as a deaf person that he couldn't get in the regular deaf community. So we looked at ways of working collaboratively with the deaf community so that people who had deafness plus something else would also be able to be served, on and on. One of the issues that I think is important to briefly mention is the issue of racial diversity, which I think all of us clearly understand and have been looking at and engaging in for a number of decades. But what is really, I think, important about what's been happening now in the more than 10 or 20 years that there's been a greater focus on racial diversity and disability is parent organizations that have been started to work with families who have kids with disabilities. Again, a very important issue to ensure the kinds of education kids are going to be getting, but also that the IDEA, 504, and the ADA have also been benefiting disabled individuals from different backgrounds. Recent data came out that says 59% of college graduates with disabilities are from communities of color. That is like an amazing figure. But one of my areas of concern is that many of those individuals, regardless of their race, are not identifying as having disabilities because of the stigma of disability. So our movement now, in addition to becoming more cross disability, more racially diverse, on and on, a big emphasis, I believe, needs to continue to be on getting people who have disabilities not to be ashamed of their disability, to recognize the power of coming together, to be able to address discrimination within their families, within their primary communities, and across the board. It's great that the LGBTQ community, for example, really, I think for many years now, has been looking at disability as being a part of their community. But when you speak to many disabled individuals who are from the LGBTQ community, they will talk about the same kinds of barriers, not being accepted by others within the community because of their disabilities, places not being accessible, people not looking at dating someone with a disability. So these are issues that are long-term, but I think the stronger our movement, the more those changes can come about.
Wow, Judy, thank you so much for that amazing, reflection. I do want to turn to Katherine a little bit. I'd love for you to respond to Judy, because Judy's laid out, a lot of work here, that needed to happen, before the ADA, and now, of course, we know, what the work ahead looks like. And there's this kind of like a torch passing, right? That we're having here in this conversation between Judy and you, and of course future generations as well. So I'd love some reflections from you as to what Judy has just said in terms of what it took to get to where we are today, and what do you think the work ahead looks like?
I'm just always so in awe, Judy, whenever you speak. I think of you as like a friend and a mentor. And someone that I could just like text with, but I forget, like, you're this like huge role model and icon. And I mean, you really paved the way for where we're at today. And when I look back, when I think of like what you went through, pre 504, pre ADA, when you sued, the New York Education Department to become a teacher, and they wouldn't let you because you had a physical disability because you used a wheelchair. I'm just so incredibly in awe, because back then, you didn't have we didn't have the ADA, we didn't have any disability civil rights laws that protected you, that said that that folks with disabilities can be a teacher and can't be discriminated against. And so you took that case up, and really it was just like the first of its kind, and it was so revolutionary. And I think about it now and the work that we're doing at the Qualo Center, with getting more students with disabilities into law school, and what we're able to do now, because we have things like 504 and the ADA, which are tools for us to use to be able to not only get students into higher education and to different professions, but also like expand the boundaries and push the boundaries of what disability access looks like, is just, it's pretty amazing to think of that, to think how far we've come, and that, you helped us get there, and you really paved the way for us to get there.
Katherine, with the program that you're running right now, the Qualo Institute just had a class of 15 students complete their course, helping them look at law school as a potential future for themselves or public policy, and you're just starting your second class. What have some of those students said to you about the barriers that they're currently facing and issues they're trying to address?
One thing over and over that I'm hearing from these students is they didn't think that law school was going to be a possibility for them. Undergrad, a lot of them still are undergrad students, and a lot of them, are already leaders. I don't like using the term next generation, because it's like they're already the leaders, right, in their respective schools getting disability accommodation. So they've already had sort of this struggle in their undergrad years, trying to get access. So even just thinking about law school, or whether they'll be able to apply, get in, succeed in law school, is just something I think that intimidated a lot of them. So what I'm hearing over and over that our program did for them was it made them confident to think that, yes, I can go to law school. Yes, I can apply to law school, and people with disabilities can be successful in law school, but also are desperately needed in this profession. So, we have a lot to do.
Why are they desperate?
Well, the most obvious thing is that, okay, we have 504, we have ADA, but the people who are enforcing it, so our attorneys, our judges, our politicians, who are enforcing it, who are interpreting it, who are going to court and representing disabled folks, a lot of these folks are still non-disabled people. So, nothing about us without us. We're desperately needed because our lived experience is so valuable in enacting these laws. So yeah, so we need more disabled attorneys, disabled judges, disabled politicians, etc.
I mean, I think the point is also that it's been very important to get classroom teachers, for example, that are male and Latino and Asian, indigenous populations, so that people reflect the people that they're working with. And I feel, you know, also that there's a real value when going to court, when getting representation, that people understand the types of issues that disabled people might be facing that are above and beyond what other people may be facing. Even in the way people represent themselves. You know, you look at issues around someone with an intellectual disability who may be accused of committing a certain crime, and you have a non-disabled individual who's committed the same crime. The person with the intellectual disability may well get a more strict sentence than the person without the disability, because if they're not appropriately represented, they may not understand the nuances of restricting things that they're going to say, because they're asked a question, they give an answer. So I think it's important that the multiple parts of who we are, where in fact we have to be involved in the law in some way, it's very important that people understand some of the complexities of the issues. And seeing ourselves, I think, as you've been saying, is so really important. I would say really the more we can, and now obviously I don't mean literally, because yes, you can see me, I use a wheelchair. But you know, if you're a lawyer representing someone and you can speak about your psychosocial disability with someone who may have a psychosocial disability also, you become a role model for that individual. You know, you're a woman, you're a Latina, you're a woman with a hidden disability. I think all of those are very important when we're both representing people and trying to have meaningful discussions with both the disability community and the broader community.
You know, the ADA is so important, and 504 and ADA are so important to us as tools. Again, I just keep like reflecting back, Judy, on how you like took this case to court through the district court system in New York, and you didn't have the ADA, you didn't have 504, but now we do have the ADA and 504, so we have like this law on our side to make these arguments and to push the boundaries, right? So I just wanted to share that this week I put together a workshop with law schools across the nation, and we had, you know, some of the top law schools like Harvard, Yale, Berkeley, New York University, Loyola Law School, UCLA, and a lot of regional schools as well, Miami, Pittsburgh. I mean, I can go on and on. I think it was almost like 20 law schools. And we had deans, associate deans, faculty, and also students join for this workshop. And it was such an incredible conversation. I'm kind of like coming off of the high of it from this week, because, you know, I mean, we're talking about, like I said a little bit earlier, like not only like basic access, but really like how do we push the boundaries so that all students are able to participate in law school, including folks with more non-apparent disabilities. And I mean, like I was saying earlier, that these conversations that I were having, it's not with like radical activists, disabled folks. You know, sometimes we feel like we're in our bubble having these conversations. Like these conversations that we were having this week were with, you know, the heads of these top legal institutions, and you know, they were talking about how they wanted to do more, how they wanted to push the boundaries, how the ADA was the floor, not the ceiling, and how we want to change the climate and the culture. I mean, we even, a big part, again, a big part of how I lead in the Qualo Center is through an intersectional justice lens too. So I really made sure that a lot of our conversations this week were intersectional. And, you know, again, to like see these mostly non-disabled, you know, more of a white crowd, you know, higher ups in these legal education talk about, intersectional justice. It was pretty incredible. But again, I think that missing piece is always that, yeah, we're getting these folks of power to talk about it, but really the next step is going to be like getting more disabled people and queer disabled people of color into these positions as well. So, but it's a start. I mean, I'm coming off this high of this week of feeling like we really are moving the needle. We're moving the needle.
So I agree with you that we're moving the needle. But my experience, and I'm curious, because you're in a position right now where you're head of the Coelho Center, and as you've been saying, it gives you the opportunity to talk to people beyond Loyola, but to talk to law schools around the country and to convene them. My experience also has been that, you went, where did you go to law school? UCLA?
UCLA.
And at UCLA, when you were there, you took a lot of courses on law and racial justice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I got a specialization in critical race studies.
And there was nothing on disability.
Yeah, in the 3 years that I was there, they never offered a disability law course.
So in the convening you had this week, how much further beyond accessibility did the discussions go?
Yeah, accessibility was part of it. Accommodations were part of it. But also, we talked a lot about disability culture and disability climate. So the idea of it can't all be medical model. It can't all be about wellness, which is a huge new thing, right? Like wellness, it can't all be about an accommodation process that happens through the disability services. Like the student goes to the disability service, get their accommodation, don't talk about it, don't disclose that you're a disabled person. We talked a lot about how we need to think about disability as a community culture, something to be proud, something to have pride in, and that fostering that kind of culture within the law school is important and is also going to take us where we need to go. So
I think one area, using education as an example, is when we can stop discussing and I'm not talking about what you did this week. What you did this week sounds really very creative. And it was great because you could focus in on one theme around law schools. But I think more broadly, we're still seeing that universities are focusing a lot on the issue of accommodations and accessibility and are not yet really looking at or creating disability studies majors, integrating disability studies into Black studies, women's studies, Latino studies, whatever the specialty area is. And so obviously a student some of the disabled students who go to universities will not be as successful as they could be if the university is not both providing what people need and also helping to create the environment on campus where disabled students can feel equal to others. So again, you see cultural centers being set up on many college campuses, and cultural centers for disabled people are beginning to be set up, but not to the same degree. And the cultural centers themselves are not necessarily cross-cultural. So if you are a Latina disabled person, you could benefit from the Women's Cultural Center, the Latino Cultural Center, the Disability Cultural Center, and everybody working together. So I would say, again, from what I had said in the beginning, we still have so much further to go because the community, we're trying to meld complex things together that others have not yet done. And so I think it's a real wonderful opportunity. The Black Disabled Lives Matter is a very important component for me of Black Lives Matter. That disabled Black people were able to come together and come forward and say, as disabled Black people, we need to be looked at and looked at for who we are, what some of our unique issues are that the movement needs to be looking at. And, being Jewish, it's the same thing there. looking at disability and Judaism needs to be connected, on and on. So one of the reasons I think universities, for example, play such an important role in this is they are places for thinking. You know, it's real opportunities to bring these diverse communities together, to really have serious discussions that can help expand the impact of justice, so that it really is beginning to reflect the various communities that experience injustice. And one of the reasons I think that we need to be helping people learn about the kinds of discrimination that disabled people face. People need to understand that we have 60 to 70% of disabled people in juvenile facilities and adult facilities, most of whom are people of color. Why is that? When did people acquire their disabilities? Were they benefiting from the IDEA? Should they have been benefiting from the IDEA, et cetera? So I think it's very exciting, really, that there are so many more things that we need to be doing and more people wanting to do this that really can enrich not only our community, but the broader society.
Yeah, I think that's right. Everything you said, completely spot on.
So let's talk about disability justice. What does disability justice mean to you? What does disability justice is justice for all, that terminology mean? And within that context, what is that future that we're trying to to shape with this work, that we're trying to realize with disability justice? Maybe let's start with Katherine.
So, disability justice, the disability justice movement was coined by folks from the group Sins Invalid, Patty Byrne, a lot of queer disabled people of color. So first of all, I just wanted to say that and give them credit where credit is due. And disability justice really, Sins Invalid and the folks who started the disability justice movement have a really good blog post on the 10 principles of disability justice. And I won't recite them all here, but I think a really important part of disability justice is what we are talking about here, and it's intersectional justice, centering the most impacted within our community. So that means, queer, disabled, people of color. And like Judy was just saying too, moving beyond just, the typical things that we think about when we think about what the ADA covers and what counts as disability rights. So, the ADA has done a lot for education, for higher education, for employment. But as Judy was just saying, what about the criminal injustice system? What about immigration? What about some of these other areas that we traditionally have thought of more through a racial lens or civil rights lens, but not through an intersectional lens that includes disability? So disability justice is really pushing us to think outside the box from where the traditional disability rights movement has been. And then also to an important component of it always is about representation. So making sure that our leadership reflects our population and that we have more queer, disabled people of color in leadership positions.
For me, when we're looking at disability, we need to look at part of the uniqueness is the onset of disability. So many people are acquiring their disabilities in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And the reason I think, there are issues we need to look at with that population of individuals is they've grown up with the view that disability is typically, or disabled people are not typically equal to non-disabled people. And they've not been exposed because of the lack of representation in the media to who we are, what we are as individuals and as communities. So we need the population of people covering the complete scope of our disabilities. Scope's not the right word, but people who reflect the diversity of our communities, and that diversity includes age. We need for people who will acquire disabilities to be able to have positive examples of who we are as disabled people. So they don't feel alone. Because, I came from a Jewish family. Mark, you came from a Filipino family. Kat, you came from a Latino family. So we had a certain community, a part of who we were and are in our families. But I had no one in my family who had a disability. Kat had a sister with a disability. I don't know about you, Mark, but it's very common. Did you have anyone else in your family that had a disability, Mark?
No, not until at a later stage in their lives, much, much later.
Yeah, when people become older. But I speak about this because not only do we have 61 million disabled people identified, but we have millions and millions of others who will temporarily or permanently acquire a disability. We want them to see that acquiring a disability is not the end of their life. We want them also to be supportive of things that we are fighting for today. Improve mental health services, improve laws on housing, improve laws on requirement that all people have health insurance, improve laws that have funding for home and community-based services, for people to be able to hire people to help you get up and get dressed and bathe and go to the bathroom if you need help in the community. We want people who are not immediately affected by these issues to see that they or someone in their family today or tomorrow may well be affected by things that we're discussing. So we really, for me, that's very important. The stronger our movement gets, the more individual people can feel empowered and demanding respect for who they are, the more the people around us will see that it not only benefits us individually to be able to participate equally, but it does benefit them. And I think that is the same message that we're giving when we're discussing justice across the board in the United States, that racial equality and socioeconomic disparities are things that we have to address in order for our country to be able to thrive to the maximum extent possible.
Really fantastic conversation, Judy and Catherine. I do have one final question for both of you. What gives you hope?
What gives you hope, Judy? Oh no, me first.
What gives me hope is people like Catherine and
Oh,
you, Mark. No, really, when I met Mark, Mark was not identifying as a disabled person. And Kat, you said yourself that it wasn't until you got to a really low point in your life that you, for whatever reason, mental health became an issue. Your mental health became an important issue. So when we look at people around us who have been learning that they have a disability and have been willing to come forward and speak about it, and recognize how that discussion has been important for you. So Mark, I'm interested, for you, why did you decide that you would begin to look at your disability as a part of who you were, and that it could become more of a part of the discussion in your life? Why did you do that, and what changes has that made for you?
Thanks, thanks, Judy. Well, I think, of course, disability has been, a constant part of my life, but also throughout my life, I have also had to confront, the shame of having disability, and that is, a process that a lot of people do go through if you have a disability. And it wasn't really until I started talking to other people in the disability community, like you, Judy. You've been really pivotal in helping me fight that shame. And it is because of the many conversations that we've had that I started, pivoting, that I started really kind of tackling that shame and trying to confront it and trying to overcome it. My career has always been in the human rights in the field, in the justice movement. Unfortunately, disability has not been part of that work that I've been doing for many years. So I wasn't really as exposed to other people with disabilities, especially leaders in the field. And I think, one critical step that I had to take was to have that exposure, to be talking to and working, with the disability community itself. So I really give, a big credit to you, Judy, for helping me, dig in deeper, into myself in terms of confronting that shame of having a disability. And I'm still in the process, right? It's a huge process that's going to go on for a while. It's just not something that you can just switch off. There's a lot of personal reflection and journey that goes through with that. It's more like, how do I continue to empower myself to own my disability and to do the justice work that I need to do. And now, of course, thanks to you and thanks to my conversations with other, people in the community, this is now going to be part of my work moving forward. So that's kind of the process that I'm taking on right now.
And Kat?
The question about what am I hopeful about, or another question?
What are you hopeful about, and how have you, as a person with an invisible disability, brought that more to the forefront when working both with other disabled people and non-disabled people?
Okay, well, I'll start with the hopeful. What has really made me hopeful recently is the Black Lives Matter movement, and all of the protests have been going on over the last several weeks now. It came from something really negative, right? But it actually filled me with a lot of hope to be out there and to see like the community really rallying around this cause, and not only the community and the typical folks who have been on board with Black Lives Matter, but for it to become more common and more wide-reaching. And now we're seeing a lot of changes get enacted. This is something, I work with a lot of legal organizations, a lot of nonprofits. Like, this is work that folks have been doing for a long, long, long time, right? They've been trying to get, prison abolition. They've been trying to get, all these different policy changes, right? And it's the same with disability as well, right? Like, we've been working on these issues from like a very legal, like top-down perspective, but to see it be a grassroots movement that really is pushing these changes to be made, and a lot more quickly than, in the past several weeks, and they have over the last several decades that we've been trying to work on it from a policy level, it really has shown me the power of the people. And so for me, that has given me hope. And seeing that a lot of people, like you were saying, Judy, with Black Disabled Lives Matter, that a lot of people are making this an intersectional issue, and like really noting that, the criminal justice system is just not about race, it's also about disability, right? These are Black and brown folks, but these are actually disabled Black and brown folks as well. So I look forward to, I have this renewed sense of hope and excitement around engaging with not only the disability grassroots, like activist movement, but also with other movements and like pushing, all of our agendas forward. So that gives me hope. Another thing that gives me hope is, I think we talked a lot about how great the ADA was and how far it's taken us and how I use it as a tool in my job to push the boundaries of inclusion within legal education for people with disabilities. But, there have been constraints to the ADA, and one of the biggest ones is that the ADA couldn't legislate the hearts and minds of people, right? So we can't legislate people to like get rid of negative attitudes and stigma and stereotypes and that kind of stuff. So that kind of work happens again on like a societal level, but also an important area that this work is done is in media. It's in television and the power of Hollywood, right? So I've been doing a little bit of work also. I know Judy and Ford Foundation, you guys have also been doing a lot of great work on this area on disability representation in media. And so I've been working with Maysoon Zaid, Danielle Perez, Jillian Mercado, with these three folks and writing a white paper right now through the Qualo Center. So we've been having like weekly conversations, and they give me hope. Like, it's really cool to hear about what these, three disabled women of color are doing, and really breaking through in Hollywood to shift representations of people with disability, but not only disability, but also with all of their intersectional identities. And I really believe, I mean, I'm big on the legal stuff. Like, I'm really excited to see like where we can move the law, where we can move, the ADA. But really, it's this other piece, disability representation and media, that gives me a lot of hope. And I think that there's like this shift that is happening, right? Like, not only Crip Camp, but a lot more shows are like portraying people with disabilities, and so that gives me hope. Because ultimately it is going to come down to people's, perceptions of disability. So I think that we're in like a critical moment right now where that is shifting.
Yeah, what gives me hope is that we continue to make progress. COVID does give me pause and potentially hope. COVID because so many things have abruptly changed and affected our entire community in a way where disabled people had been affected more in the past, and our lack of opportunities were not really seen in the same way. But now that people are having to stay home and deal with things, virtually, people are seeing that things can be done virtually in a way that couldn't be done before. On the other hand, I want to make sure that nobody thinks that living life virtually is where disabled people want to go. We want to be able to live our lives like anybody else. We don't want to be stuck at a computer because people think now we don't need to worry about accessibility or accommodations on the work side or transportation or anything like that. We need to make sure that we're a part of the discussion. Jobs are going to be changing because of COVID and other things that were happening before COVID. I want to make sure that disabled people are really a part of those discussions, where we're looking at the changing world of work and the education that people need and the training that people will need and the accommodations that people may need to, again, be assured that disabled people are not locked out of these future opportunities and realities. So that's the combination of really potential positive things happening, and then on the other hand, negative things happening because we are still not a central part of these discussions. For me, the Black Lives Matter over the last number of months has been very emotional, not just because of the issues that the Black Lives Movement is bringing forward on race and historical treatment in the United States of Black Americans, but obviously the whole issue of immigrants and the status of people living in the United States who are quote unquote not legal. That's another huge issue of concern for me. But disability is something that still is not really discussed as a central part, as I've been saying, of the work of other movements. So when we are looking at the juvenile injustice system, as Kat so correctly spoke about, I don't really see a lot being done to identify the fact that many of these youth should have been identified as needing support services because they had disabilities when they were in primary and secondary school. And even if they were, they're frequently not getting the services that they should get because school districts are not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And the state and federal governments are not doing the monitoring and enforcement that they should be doing. So kids are being pushed out of school at early ages and are dropping out and are getting involved in activities they otherwise would not, and are winding up in the juvenile and adult injustice systems. So I think we really, the next steps for me of the ADA really are getting other partners to see how our issues are not just our issues, but they're issues of many other communities. And that if we don't work together, we're not going to resolve these problems. or these biases, these acts of discrimination.
Mhm.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Katherine and Judy, for this amazing conversation. And I hope that this conversation continues not just in this YouTube channel, but in real life, in other venues, in other social media platforms as well, between many members of the community. And yeah, we just definitely want to have more of these types of intergenerational conversation, because there's a lot that we can learn from leaders who've been in the field for many decades, and from leaders who are who are shaping the new leaders who are shaping the field right now, the work ahead. Thank you both for sharing with us your wisdom and your reflections, and thank you to everybody for tuning in.
I want to thank you for doing this special edition of The Human Perspective, and we'll look forward to doing more with you. Thank you, Kat.
Thank you, Judy.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.